what I'm going to try and do, again, is have you kind of be able to understand some of the issues related to the studying, the research issues in positive psychology. Certainly get a better grasp of the physical and mental health outcomes and benefits that come from practicing positive psychology. We'll be talking after lunch about mindfulness. How do we increase our resilience to the stress that we can anticipate is going to happen to us in the future? Throughout, I'll try and at least put some of the limitations of what we know about positive psychology, some of the downsides, if you will, that are potentially there. And really wanting to make sure that you understand that there are several pathways of how we start to create the traits of optimism, of a sense of being able to reframe things and be resilient going forward. Okay, so this next section really is going to be focusing on two things. One is looking at the physiology, the physical ramifications of applying some positive psychology strategies and actions to our daily life, the benefits that we can derive. And then before we break for lunch, I'll share kind of what we've been learning over the last several years in terms of post-traumatic growth. And rather than focusing on PTSD, looking at what are those factors that predict actually a real benefit from being exposed to moments where we thought we were going to die. So there's really two areas where most of the research is focused on the impact of optimism, hope, positively reframing the experience. One is in the field of immunology, and the other is on cardiac function. When it comes to looking at kind of the impact that optimism, positive thinking has on our physical health, we look at a variety of different pathways of how we get there. It's not just because of how I think that there's a direct physiologic link. Sometimes it's how I think leads to a behavior, that behavior then leads to an outcome. Now, when we look at the field of psychoneuroimmunology, most of the work is looked at people who score high on scales of optimism and how their outcomes, when challenged, immunologically speaking, are different than those who are more pessimistic. Okay, so we're looking at the trait of optimism and the benefits that conveys. Natural NK activity stands for natural killer cell activity. Here's a primary way human beings have our immune surveillance. Basically, will detect, and the lytic units, the killing power of these natural killer cells, will slow down the proliferation of tumors. So it's usually is a very good real-world marker of our immunologic health. And lo and behold, studies back to 2007, and there have been a number of replications since then, have looked at immune-compromised populations, such as breast cancer with this study, and find that the 5-year recurrence rate is much lower for women if they have an optimistic outlook. If before the diagnosis of cancer, they score high on scales of optimism. Some of that data comes from the Women's Health Initiative, longitudinal large cohort studies. Some of them are specifically designed looking at only women with breast cancer and then following them over time. But what I find most interesting and directly clinically relevant to the work I do is the studies back in 2007, 2008 that were published in BBI. That stands for Brain, Behavior, and Immunity. Now, at the time, was that almost 10 years ago, that journal, it's the most highly respected journal in the field of psychoneuroimmunology, they didn't really publish a lot of studies that were on clinical populations. There was a lot of, rats and lab animal studies that they were doing. But what I found fascinating here were two studies done by two different research teams, pretty much at the same time, and neither team knew that the other was doing what they were doing. But they did fairly similar things. One group was studying women with breast cancer. The other research team looked at men with prostate cancer. And what these two different teams did independently was put these cancer populations through a mindfulness-based stress reduction program. about an 8 or 10 week class workshop that would teach them about mindful meditation, how to be focused on the present, how to engage in kind of flexible thinking, how to be non-judgmental, how to see thoughts as just thoughts, and a variety of concepts and practicing skills and so forth. And it turns out that after these 10 weeks, they followed people for actually years down the road. And lo and behold, 6 months, each study showed that 6 months after the workshop, the 10 weeks was over, both the breast cancer and prostate cancer patient populations showed lowering of their cortisol and an increase in their natural killer cell activity. Not just the count, how many natural killer cells were in circulation, but how robust were they able to kind of fend off tumor proliferation. So that seemed very clinically relevant for anyone to really consider, how do I use some of these concepts to lower cortisol, increase NK activity, which would likely then slow down tumor proliferation. The other thing that's relevant here in the field of psychoneuroimmunology and positive psychology has to do with Jamie Pennybaker and the diary-keeping studies. Now, it always surprises me how few people in the field of mental health are aware of or read any of this data. Because, in my opinion, Dr. Pennybaker, who is a social psychologist, he's not a clinical psychologist, a social psychologist has promoted studies that have been more supportive of psychotherapy than any psychologist I know who's ever lived. And he did it because he didn't think it would work. So he, as a true scientist and as a social psychologist, the story goes that he was sitting around with his clinical therapy colleagues, and they were touting how this cathartic experience, talking about your feelings, would result in these health benefits. And he thought that was a bunch of hogwash. So what he did is he kind of tried to simulate the therapeutic kind of cathartic experience. And now his studies and others like them have been replicated over 130 times, with the results pretty much the same. This is a very robust kind of concept. What they would do is they would bring people into the lab, and for 30 minutes they would sit them down and have them write, like in a diary, about a personally traumatic event that happened to them somewhere in the past, whether it be in the previous week, the previous year, or the distant past. After 30 minutes, they put the pen down and they go home. They come back the very next day, sit down for 30 minutes, write for 30 minutes about that same traumatic event, put the pen down, go home. They would do this for 4 days in a row. Okay? Now, the results are pretty similar whether you do it once a day for 4 days in a row or once a week for 4 weeks in a row. The benefit actually is greater if you write versus when you talk into a tape recorder, but the benefits are still there. And they would always compare this diary-keeping, disclosure group to a control group, which are doing 30-minute sessions 4 times, and they're writing, but not about something that's personally stressful, something that's benign, emotionally, neutral, like what's in your kitchen cupboard, or, tell me about the geography of the East Coast of the United States or something. At the end of the 4th session, very consistently, which group is better off? The control group, right? Turns out that 4 sessions of 30 minutes writing about an upsetting traumatic event makes you more upset. You report more negative emotions, less positive emotions. You actually, immunologically speaking, if there's any difference between the groups, it's actually the diary-keeping group that is worse off. They're not having as robust of a response immunologically to a viral challenge. And in fact, if it's once a week for 4 weeks, it's the diary-keeping group that actually goes to the doctor more often. They're complaining more of, fatigue, aches and pains and the like. They're taking more over-the-counter remedies. And the same is true. Now, they've done this 4 times. That's it. 1 month after it's all over, they still see the same thing. 3 months later, they still see that compared to the control group, the diary disclosure group is worse off. And so that didn't look good. Fortunately, Pennybaker and the original studies and every study since has gone out at least 6 months, most of them at least 12 months, and most often what you find on most measures between month 3 and month 6 is a total reversal of the pattern. It's only after time do you now see that the disclosure group actually is better off, more positive emotion, less negative emotion. Immunologically speaking, if there's a difference, they're better off not only than the control group, but even better than when they started, which is an important distinction. And they're going to the doctor less often, taking fewer medications for aches and pains and so forth. But what I think has been most helpful in the studies since then is trying to understand the fan effect. As I mentioned before, some people who've gone through this 30 minutes, 4 times exercise get worse, even a year later. A lot of people actually show a mild to moderate impact, and some people really benefit a lot. So the more recent studies looked at, so what are the factors that predict a person really benefiting from this? Well, there's 3 things. One is that the disclosure must be relatively novel. You can't take a person who had something happen to them tragically 6 years ago, and they've told their story now so many times it's kind of humorous. They've wrapped a story around it. And if they're going to tell it for the 14th time, you can't expect any benefit. It's something that's been held close to the vest and is a relatively new kind of disclosure or cathartic experience. Second thing is that the disclosure, the writing, the diary, must be personally, emotionally relevant. People who kind of pretend they're narrating and just observing something and weren't actually there, he said this, she said this, and then this happened, people don't benefit a whole lot from that. But literally, the more emotionally loaded words are in the diary, the more the immunologic benefit is 12 months later. Okay? This is what I thought and felt at the time that it happened. This is how I think and feel about it now. The third and probably the most important of all, the factor that drives benefit here is people come to a, quote, new meaning of that event in the larger context of their life. It's not just, it was awful, it was terrible, and so forth. They go through a process in these 4 30-minute sessions. The first sessions are, wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Bad. But by sessions 3 and 4, they're writing things such as, well, that's interesting. The more I think about this, I realize that this benefit has occurred because of that bad event. So the original studies were on men who were HIV positive. And all of them had the trauma that they wrote about was the death of their partner to AIDS. But the ones who really benefited a year later had in their kind of writings things such as, as bad as it was, it's interesting, I find greatest meaning now from volunteering at the needle exchange program. I didn't start doing that until my partner died. I really get into kind of serving the community's needs at the soup kitchen or volunteering, and I didn't do that until this bad thing occurred. So if you will, it's kind of this silver lining that occurs to them. It doesn't make it all good, for sure, but it's this cognitive flexibility, which you'll hear me use that term again later today, cognitive flexibility of realizing maybe there's more than one way to think about it. That can be a state we're in. We engage in behaviors that, how can I think about this differently? You do that often enough, and it can become a trait. It's just how you start to think about things.